QA. What about QA? Well, QA is a very commonly word used in the translation space. What do people mean by it? Well, a lot of people, when they talk about QA, more abstractly, they refer to quality assurance, which is the question of how do you ensure quality. So when you talk about, let's say, a translation process and someone asks you, well, what about QA? A lot of people are referring to, well, how do you make sure that that's accurate? How do you make sure that that's good? So that's one aspect of what people mean by quality assurance. Other people, when they talk about QA, they're talking about the very specific process that takes place within a translation framework where at the end of the translation, typically, either the entire file or part of the file is inspected for quality. That inspection for quality could include a wide range of errors. It could include syntactical deviations like missing periods, like extra spaces, like characters that are too long. It could include semantic issues like omissions, additions, changes in meaning. It could include missing translations. It could include a wide range of potential issues. Sometimes those issues are just fixed. Sometimes they're also mapped onto reports. Now, typically when translations are QA'd at scale, they're typically done mechanically using software that's going to syntactically go through a very large document, for instance, and find terminological inconsistencies, parts where the glossary wasn't applied, etc., and flag all those errors, and then the translator will have to go manually through each of those flags and either attribute them as false positives or fix them, etc. And I find this process horrible. I find it terrible. Syntactical QA is highly imprecise, highly unreliable, unless we're talking about something that doesn't lead to false positives, like for instance a missing period, or even then you're going to get false positives. But you're typically going to get a lot of flags. And let's talk about terminology, for instance. There are many places where you're going to have the same term that either is going to be used with a different kind of, it's going to be in the plural form as opposed to the singular form. Maybe it's going to be expressed differently. Maybe it's going to be implied. And to have someone have to go through each and every one of these flags and manually either fix them or mark them as not real is excruciating work. And in theory, all that work should have been done during the translation process if the translation process was well executed. But that's just my opinion around this kind of like syntactical QA work. Now, when we're talking about LQA, that's typically a deeper linguistic assessment that's done over a small part of the text. I also have my issues around that. Typically, LQA will get very technical about text and won't necessarily take into account that, for instance, maybe there's a comma that's missing, but maybe that's not the end of the world. Maybe that's actually could be even better for the overall expression of the text, and then it becomes a matter of linguistic technicality as opposed to how you're actually resonating with the audience and delivering the text. But anyway, that's my opinion on LQA, for instance. But the fact is that when you're talking about QA, you can be talking about the idea of ensuring quality. You could be talking about these actual processes like QA or LQA that are performed during the overall translation process. Now, that leads us to an even bigger question, right? Which is, what is quality these days? And that's a huge question. It's a very thorny subject, and let's talk about lots of different assumptions. The first assumption that I see is whenever machine translation is involved, the very first flag that gets raised by translators typically is, what about QA? So there's this assumption that machine translated content is going to generate lower quality and is going to make it hard for people to ensure quality. Now, there are statistics out there that we have, for instance, that show that the correlation is actually the opposite. If you're working with good machine translation in a good environment, you're actually increasing the likelihood of good quality translations rather than decreasing it. So there's that premise over there. The other thing that I think is rapidly shifting is the idea of quality itself. For so long, quality was a technical thing, right? Is the comma there? Is it not there? Are all of the words that were in the source accounted for in the target? Is the embodiment of the expression there? And you could layer it, right? You could layer the more basic syntactical stuff and the terminological stuff and the overall meaning, and you can assign different weights and severities to different QA rating systems. But the fact is that for a long time, and I think still is something technical, but I think QA is going to evolve very quickly into something that's all about engagement. Because it doesn't matter ultimately in the current age that we live in my opinion, it doesn't matter if the content was technically well written or not. If it's a blog, for instance, and nobody stays on the page and it has incredible bounce rate, it could have been impeccably written. The quality sucks. From an engagement perspective, it sucks. And it could have been terribly written. It could be full of mistakes, but it's interesting, it's catchy, it's controversial, it's edgy, gets a ton of engagement. The quality is great, right? So quality, in my opinion, is in the eye of the beholder, in the sense that not only it's subjective, because that's what text, the nature of text is that it's owned by the reader. Every reader has their own interpretation of quality, but it's also in the eye of the beholder in the sense that, or in the eye of the owner in the sense that it depends on what you want to do with something, right? If, let's say it's a dissertation and it has to be free of any categorical kind of grammar errors, that's fine. Maybe that's the meaning of quality there. But if the goal for that dissertation is to pass, and the goal is to impress the board that's evaluating that dissertation, that thesis, maybe it's another thing that should be looked at language. So when you talk about QA, most people think about it as a very technical thing. And is the language correct? Is the language incorrect? And in my opinion, language is always about doing things, right? This is not my idea. This is Ludwig Wittgenstein, Tractatus Philosophicus. Language is a way of doing things. It's not a way of expressing things. It's a way of getting things done. The hammer is called a hammer, not because someone said that the hammer should be called a hammer, but because someone had to drive a nail in. That's why they needed the word. Hey, you need a hammer there, right? Not to get too philosophical about it, but I think language is a way of getting things done. And when you look at that way, quality is just a measure of how effectively you're getting those things done. Is your goal to engage? Is your goal to sell? Is your goal to get people to stay on the page? Is your goal to get people to vote a certain way? What is your goal? That is the measure of quality, right? And I think it's very challenging for people that come from a linguistic background, that are more purists, to understand and accept that this way of looking at quality is the way of the future. But we'd love to hear your comments and your ideas on what quality is and what it isn't when it comes to text and translation. And if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Talk to you next time.